Thanks very much. I'll generally try and lighten the mood, I think. The people who know a lot more about the publishing business than I do say that it's quite useful if you can get royalty into your book. So I've written about the financial crisis, but I've got the Queen in there. And this is the Queen's famous question when she went to the LSE at the height of the crisis. And the question was, if these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? And it's a killer question. It's a killer question for economists. I think the answer from the perspective of economists is not that they failed to predict a crisis, it's they predicted too many crises. So economists have been banging on about global imbalances since the 1980s, and I think in some ways that was probably the right thing, because I started this project having thought that the crisis was something that had arisen in relatively recent years, and it was the excesses in America. It was these famous ninja mortgages, mortgages for people with no income, no job, and no assets. But it was the forces that created this, I think, built up over a much longer time period, so perhaps 30 years. And I think it does pose a little bit of a problem in terms of how policymakers, in particular, respond to the crisis and to future crises. Because one of the things that went wrong, I think, was that policymakers were a little bit too obsessed with fighting the last economic war, which was all about inflation. So the fact that inflation had been very subdued since the early 1990s didn't prevent inflation targeting becoming preeminent in economic policy. And that meant, I think, they took their eyes off the bigger picture, the fact that there was an enormous amount of credit growth happening and an enormous amount happening within the banks. The other problem was that policymakers were quite good at handling small crises. So we had a series of small crises, beginning with perhaps with the Asian crisis more than a decade ago. And from the perspective of the advanced world, they were handled pretty well. Interest rates were cut in response. And that helped to create a mood of excessive confidence that people believed, central bankers believed, governments believed, and so did business, so did the markets, so did consumers, that there was no downside, that if a problem arose, it could be tackled. And I think those smaller crises led, perhaps, and the successful handling of those led to the bigger one. And for policymakers, that's a real problem, because you never know at the start of the crisis whether it's a small one or a large one. And nobody would forgive you for failing to respond to what turns out to be a small crisis, if in fact that was the big one. So that is a problem that I think will persist. The other issue, of course, that has arisen is to do with the banks, and we've seen a lot of things happening on the regulatory front. How can banks be better controlled? How can they be made to hold more capital? How can they be made crisis-proof? How can they be turned into institutions which we thought were perfectly safe? I mean, we thought that turning on the supply of water was just like turning on the tap. It was always there, it was safe, and it was reliable. I think what we've discovered is that nobody can really properly regulate banks if banks are determined to avoid regulation. The people who design new products within the banks, people who park things off balance sheet, people who are doing the kind of things that Lehman Brothers were doing before the crisis, will always be beyond the grasp of the regulators. And will always be beyond the notice, I think, of the bank's own boards. If you're a board member of a bank, you don't have a lot of idea of what's going on in the inner workings of the system. So I think that is a real problem. The other thing the crisis exposed, of course, was the thin veneer of consensus among economists. That we had thought that there was a kind of macroeconomic consensus before this crisis. Almost as soon as it started, they were at each other's throats. And more recently, I don't think we've quite seen 364 economists putting their names to a single letter, but between them, all the letters we've seen on the various sides of the argument about fiscal policy, it probably adds up to around about 364. So the thin veneer of consensus has disappeared. In terms of what comes next, and I'm sure David will touch on this, and Paul already has, there is a huge fiscal hangover to be tackled. And I think what we will see is that the public sector is heading, but perhaps the biggest squeeze we've seen since the 1920s, bigger than the post-1976 period when we were forced to turn to the IMF. I think the good news is that as far as the UK is concerned, comes on the back of a prolonged period of very strong growth in public expenditure, where public expenditure grew much more rapidly than the rest of the economy. Already built in there, I'm afraid, Paul, are big cuts in capital spending. Capital spending is going to halve whoever is elected in May. But that, again, comes on the back of the biggest expansion in capital spending we've ever seen. Something like 17% in real terms annually for the last 10 years. And you may not notice it on the transport infrastructure. You do notice it in the number of schools, hospitals, etc. that have been rebuilt. But it's going to be painful. It will be very painful. And the hangover will be a very long one. If you think about where we were before the crisis in 2007, we thought that a good place to be in terms of government debt as a share of GDP was 40%. That was the government ceiling. Now we're about 60%. It will go perhaps to 80% before it starts to come down. And on plausible assumptions, it will take until the 2030s to get back to where we thought we were in 2007, to 40% of GDP. So this is a generational effect. It takes a generation to get over a crisis such as this. The second consequence in terms of what comes next is that we've been through a long period where people thought markets knew best. It wasn't just too much concentration and emphasis on financial markets, but also the marketization of public services, the belief that you could introduce internal markets in all sorts of areas. A market solution was best. I think there's going to be a lot of skepticism about market solutions beyond the financial markets. So people will be more skeptical about markets. The third thing I would say is, and it's very bad manners to plug two books in one session, but just before the crisis, I wrote a book about China and India called The Dragon and the Elephant. And when I wrote that, in prospect was, and ongoing of course, was this shift towards China and India. And at that time, it looked as though China would overtake Japan as the world's second largest economy around about 2015, and would overtake America as the largest economy in the 2030s. Now, what is in prospect is that China will overtake Japan this year and will overtake America in the 2020s. So you've had a situation where Western economies are hobbled by the banking crisis and the need to repair banks, and also the overhang in the public finances. China, India economies like that are much less affected. So the effect of the crisis, I think, has been to shift the balance of power forward by 5 to 10 years. It was shifting anyway, but the speed of that shift has moved forward by 5 to 10 years. But I would say, and I try and end on a positive note here, that we've had the big negative shock of the crisis. We've had the negative shock that preceded that of a big rise in commodity prices, which was hugely damaging, not just here, but mainly in the developing world. I regard the rise of China and India as a huge positive economic shock to the global economy, one which will give us a lot of growth as long as we can start to take more advantage of it. Thank you.